In this video, we're going to begin working on factoring polynomials. And the first technique that we're going to look at is how we factor by factoring out a GCF, or greatest common factor. This is always the first step that we should try when we're factoring a polynomial, is to try and factor out a GCF. We're going to look at all the terms in the polynomial, find the greatest common factor that divides into all those terms, and then actually factor that out of the polynomial and see what's left behind. So let's look at the two problems at the bottom of the page here. We're going to factor out the GCF for the following. So I look at the two terms, 5x squared and 10x, and I find their greatest common factor. 5 divides into both 5 and 10, and it's the biggest thing that divides into both 5 and 10. And x divides into both x squared and x. So 5x is the greatest common factor of both 5x squared and 10x. So that's what we're going to factor out. And since this is a binomial, two terms, we're going to have an expression in parentheses here with two terms. And we need to fill in two spots in this polynomial. We need to figure out what we multiply by 5x to get 5x squared, and we need to figure out what we multiply by 5x to get a plus 10x. So if you think about that question, 5x times what gives us 5x squared? The answer to that question is x, so that's going to be the first term in our second factor here. And then we ask ourselves the question, 5x times what gives us 10x, positive 10x, and that's plus 2. And so there's our factorization for this first polynomial, 5x times the quantity x plus 2. We'll take the same approach in part B here. We find the GCF of these two terms. The biggest number that goes into both 8 and minus 12 is 4. And the largest power of x that goes into both x to the third and x squared is x squared. And then we need to figure out what's left behind when we factor a 4x squared out of both of those terms. So 4x times what gives us 8x to the third. 4x squared times what gives us 8x to the third. The answer to that question is 2x. And 4x squared times what gives us a minus 12x squared. The answer to that question is minus 3. And so there's our factorization by factoring out the GCF in part B. Let's do a few more. All right, part A here, 4x squared minus 32. The biggest thing that divides into both of those is 4. And then we figure out what's left behind. 4 times what gives us 4x squared? That's x squared. And 4 times what gives us minus 32? That's minus 8. And there's our factorization by pulling out the GCF. All right, now in part B, we're going to look at one with 3 terms. So we find the GCF of these 3 terms. The largest number that divides into all 3 of them is 3, and the largest power of x that divides into all 3 is x to the first. And now when we pull the GCF out, instead of only having 2 terms in our second factor, we're going to have 3. So we ask ourselves, 3x times what gives us 3x to the third? That's x squared. 3x times what gives us plus 15x squared? It's plus 5x. And 3x times what gives us minus 9x? And that's minus 3. And there's our factorization by removing the GCF. And that's really all there is to it when we're factoring out a GCF. We need to find the GCF and then think about and find what we multiply by the GCF to get each term in the original polynomial. The only way I can make it any more difficult is by adding more variables or more terms, but the basic concept remains the same. So let's look at C. We're going to factor 4x to the third y squared plus 16x squared y to the third. The biggest number that divides into both 4 and 16 is 4. The biggest power of x that goes into both x to the third and x to the second is x to the second. And the biggest power of y that goes into both y to the second and y to the third is y to the second. So that's our GCF, and now we need to figure out what we multiply by that GCF to get each term in the original polynomial. So what do we multiply by 4x squared y squared to get 4x to the third y squared? Well, all we're missing is an x. And what do we multiply by 4x squared y squared to get 16x squared y to the third? Well, we need to multiply the numerical portion by 4. And we've got all the x's there. We need one y. So x plus 4y. All right. And our last problem here. First, we find the GCF. We find the biggest number that divides into all three of these. That's 8. And the biggest power of x that divides into all three is x to the second. And then we look at the y's. The biggest power of y that divides into all three powers of y in the polynomial is y to the first. And now we figure out what's left behind. 8x squared y times what gives us 8x to the fourth y. It's going to be x squared. 8x squared y times what gives us 16x to the third y squared. That's going to be plus 2. We need 1x, and we need 1y. And then 8x squared y times what gives us minus 24x squared y to the third. We've got a minus 3 for the numerical portion. We've already got all the x's we need, and we need 2 y's, so we've got a y squared on there. All right, this concludes this video on factoring out GCF. We'll continue with more factoring techniques in the next video.